This is Trace Hunt Radio, where shocking murders meet thrilling investigations, and the hunt for killers becomes a story you can't turn away from. Listen closely, because the line between hunter and hunted is thinner than you think. Berlin, at the turn of the 20th century, was a city bursting with life. Industry roared, the streets glowed with new electric lights, and the future seemed unstoppable. But in the quieter neighborhoods, where families struggled in cramped tenements and mothers prayed for safe births, a different story was unfolding. A story drenched in blood. They called her the Crimson Midwife. To some, she appeared as a figure of mercy, a woman arriving in the dead of night to assist with childbirth. But for others, she was death itself, cloaked in red. Her victims were young mothers, found lifeless in their beds, throats slashed, while their newborns had vanished without a trace. At every scene, the same calling card remained: a pair of blood-stained scissors, placed carefully beside the body. Rumors spread faster than the police could act. Some whispered she was a failed nurse, cast out for her cruelty. Others believed she belonged to a secret cult that demanded infants as sacrifice. Still more claimed she was a ghost, the vengeful spirit of a midwife who had once lost her own child in a hospital's neglect. Whatever the truth, one thing was certain: Berlin was gripped by terror. Mothers locked their doors, fathers kept vigil through the night, and yet the Crimson Midwife seemed always to find her way inside. Tonight, we descend into one of Germany's darkest urban legends, the terrifying mystery of the Crimson Midwife. The story began in the autumn of 1901 in a cramped Berlin tenement on Alexanderstrasse. The air in the narrow stairwells reeked of coal smoke and boiled cabbage. The sounds of babies crying mingled with the shuffle of laborers returning from the factories. Inside one of those dim apartments lived Anna Weiss, a 22-year-old seamstress, heavy with her first child. Her husband, a dock worker, had left at dawn for a double shift, praying he would make it home in time for the birth. By evening, Anna's pains began. Neighbors hurried to fetch help, but the nearest clinic was crowded and underfunded, its doctors stretched thin. Instead, a woman appeared at the door, dressed in dark clothes, her bonnet tied tight beneath her chin. She introduced herself simply as a midwife. Her presence seemed calm, reassuring, as she set down a leather satchel of tools. The neighbors, relieved, returned to their rooms. No one knows what truly happened behind that closed door. But by morning, Anna Weiss was dead. Her body was discovered by her husband, sprawled across the blood-stained bed. Her throat had been slit, a pair of crimson-coated scissors laid neatly on the nightstand. And the infant she had carried for 9 long months was gone. The police arrived quickly, but in 1901, such scenes were not rare. Many chalked it up to a botched delivery, a tragic accident. Others whispered it was the work of an enraged husband, though he swore his innocence. The case was filed away with little investigation, but the neighbors spoke in hushed tones of the woman who had arrived that night, calm and quiet, disappearing into the fog before anyone could ask her name. And 3 weeks later, another mother would be found the same way. At first, the death of Anna Weiss was mourned but not feared. In Berlin's poorer districts, tragedy was an old companion. Childbirth often carried risk, and the line between accident and malice was thin in the eyes of the police. But within weeks, the whispers began again. In December of 1901, another young mother was found dead in her bed, her throat slit cleanly, her newborn missing. A pair of scissors, glistening with blood, lay placed with surgical neatness beside her body. The similarities were undeniable. The newspapers latched on quickly, dubbing the unknown killer Die Scharlachrote Hebamme, the Crimson Midwife. By February of 1902, the killings had multiplied. 3 more mothers were slain in the same fashion, each scene marked by the same crimson scissors. Their infants had vanished as though swallowed by the night. None of the neighbors reported hearing cries, though several swore they had seen a cloaked woman entering the buildings on the nights of the murders. The pattern was unmistakable. She came to homes where women were alone in labor, where fear and desperation left doors open to strangers offering help. Her arrival was quiet, almost expected, a knock in the night, a calm voice promising assistance. And when the dawn came, families found blood instead of new life. The city grew restless. Mothers refused to give birth at home without trusted relatives present. Fathers took to sitting awake through the night, revolvers resting in their laps. Neighbors formed watch groups, swearing they would never let a stranger midwife cross their threshold. But somehow, she always found her way inside. The police, reluctant at first, now faced pressure from every corner. Newspapers filled their pages with lurid illustrations of bloodied scissors and terrified infants. Priests thundered from pulpits that Berlin was under the shadow of a demon. And in the tenements, people whispered that the Crimson Midwife could not be human at all. For who else could vanish so easily into the night? Inspector Ernst Vogel, assigned to the case, described the fear in his first report. The people speak of her as though she were smoke itself. They say she enters locked rooms, leaves without sound, and steals not only infants, but the very breath from the mother's lungs. I fear we hunt not merely a killer, but a phantom. Within 6 months, at least 7 women were dead. Each killing followed the same grim ritual. Mother slain, scissors left, infant gone. Berlin had seen murders before, but this was different. This was a pattern, deliberate and theatrical, as though the killer wished her legend to grow with every life she took. The Crimson Midwife was no longer just a name in the papers. She had become a figure etched into the city's nightmares. By the spring of 1902, Berlin was choking on rumors. The Crimson Midwife had claimed nearly a dozen victims, and the city struggled to explain her. In the absence of truth, imagination filled the void. The first theory was the most practical, that she was a disgraced nurse. Some whispered of a woman expelled from the Charité hospital for malpractice, a midwife whose hands had once delivered life, but who now dealt only in death. It was said she knew the city's tenements intimately, having served them before her fall from grace. To her, the killings were not madness, but revenge against a world that had stripped her of respect. Another theory spread through the working-class neighborhoods, that the Crimson Midwife belonged to a cult. The missing infants were the proof. People believed they were being offered as sacrifices to some hidden brotherhood, their tiny lives fueling rituals whispered in basements beneath Berlin's cobblestones. Priests fanned these flames, warning that the scissors were not merely tools, but symbols. Blood-stained keys opening doors to the infernal. The most chilling rumors, however, were of a ghost. Mothers told each other in secret that the Crimson Midwife was not flesh and blood, but the restless spirit of a woman who had once lost her own child in childbirth. Betrayed by careless doctors, her grief had twisted into vengeance. Now she wandered the city, forever seeking infants to replace the one she had lost. The blood-stained scissors, people said, were the very pair once used to sever her baby's cord, cursed forever by sorrow and rage. The newspapers exploited every whisper. Headlines screamed of Satan's midwife in Berlin and ghostly killer of mothers. Sensational illustrations showed a cloaked woman holding an infant in one hand and dripping scissors in the other. Sales soared as fear deepened. Inspector Vogel, in his reports, lamented the hysteria. The public invents monsters faster than we can chase men. Each rumor is a mask that hides the face we seek. But even he could not dismiss the unease. The killings were too precise, too ritualistic. The scissors always appeared in the same place, placed carefully on a nightstand or cradle. It was as though the killer wanted to be recognized, wanted the city to tremble at her name. Meanwhile, the people turned against one another. Women who worked as midwives found themselves threatened, spat upon in the streets. A few were beaten by mobs convinced they had unmasked the killer. Clinics reported desperate mothers refusing aid, terrified that any midwife might be her. The Crimson Midwife was no longer just a murderer. She had become an idea, a terror that turned suspicion inward until every woman in black seemed a potential predator. In Berlin's taverns, the rumors grew even stranger. Some men claimed she was a witch who smeared blood on her scissors to curse the newborns she stole. Others swore she sold the infants to aristocrats who longed for heirs, making her less a demon than a trafficker cloaked in ritual. The stories multiplied, shifting and changing until the truth seemed further away than ever. And through it all, the killings continued. Mothers still died. Infants still vanished. Scissors still gleamed crimson in the dim light of Berlin bedrooms. Theories were many, answers were none. By the summer of 1902, Berlin was no longer just afraid. It was angry. Each new killing brought protests outside police stations, fathers pounding their fists on the doors, mothers weeping in the streets. The authorities, accused of doing nothing, launched an all-out campaign to catch the Crimson Midwife. Inspector Ernst Vogel ordered raids across the city. Tenement blocks were stormed in the dead of night, basements searched, women questioned at random. Midwives, once trusted figures of the community, now found themselves suspects. Some were dragged into cells for days, accused of murder by neighbors who swore they saw them in dark stairwells. A few were even paraded before crowds, only to be released later when no evidence was found. One arrest nearly tore the city apart. A young midwife named Clara Hoffman, barely 25, was accused of being the killer after a mother died under her care. Her scissors, stained with blood, were held up in court as proof. But doctors testified that the blood came from a legitimate birth, a tragedy, not a crime. Clara was freed, but not before she had been beaten in the streets by a mob screaming, "Murderin'!" The case left Berlin more divided than before. False leads multiplied. A butcher was arrested when bloodied tools were found in his cart. Pig's blood, nothing more. A nurse was detained after neighbors claimed she wandered at night with an empty pram. It was later revealed she had lost her own child and could not bear to let go of the cradle. Each failure deepened the public's fury and strengthened the Crimson Midwife's legend. The police tried bait operations. Officers disguised as pregnant women, padding their bellies with cloth, patrolled alleys at night while detectives hid nearby. But the killer never appeared. It was as if she could sense their traps, as though she was watching them as closely as they watched her. Vigilantes began to take matters into their own hands. Fathers patrolled with lanterns and pistols. Groups formed to guard tenement stairwells, attacking any woman they did not recognize. Innocent midwives fled the city, their livelihoods destroyed. Fear had turned neighbor against neighbor, suspicion against anyone who looked too ordinary or too strange. Inspector Vogel felt the weight of every failure. His notes grew darker, his handwriting jagged with exhaustion. "She is a shadow," he wrote. "We set our snares, and she steps around them. We chase smoke. The city believes in a ghost, and perhaps I am beginning to as well." The newspapers mocked him mercilessly. Cartoons showed Vogel asleep, while a cloaked woman slipped infants into her satchel. Editorials demanded his resignation. Some accused the police of knowing the killer's identity and protecting her, a conspiracy that spread quickly among Berliners desperate for explanations. And through it all, the Crimson Midwife continued. Each crime scene the same: a mother dead, an infant missing, scissors laid neatly as if signed by the killer herself. The hunt had become more than a search for a murderer. It was a war against a phantom, and Berlin was losing. The name Crimson Midwife spread through Berlin like a curse. But in the clamor of headlines, the fury of crowds, and the whispers of ghost stories, the real voices were often drowned out. The voices of the women who died. Anna Weiss, the first known victim, was just 22. A seamstress by trade, she lived with her husband in a single-room tenement, their bed pushed against the wall beside a small wooden cradle. She had dreamed of leaving the factory floor behind, of running a tiny dress shop where she could sew at her own pace. Her death, throat slit in the very room she hoped to fill with laughter, silenced those dreams forever. There was Margaret Lentz, a baker's daughter. Only 19, she had married a bricklayer and carried her first child with quiet joy. Her neighbors remembered her humming as she kneaded dough each morning, her face flushed with flour and pride. When she was found dead in her bed, crimson scissors by her side, her infant gone, her husband collapsed in the street, unable to breathe from grief. Another victim was Helene Brandt, a widow of 30 with 2 children all ready to feed. She worked as a laundress, scrubbing clothes until her fingers cracked and bled. The new child she carried had been a fragile spark of hope in her tired life. Instead, her eldest daughter discovered her body at dawn, the cradle beside the bed empty, the scissors gleaming in the weak light of morning. Each victim was different, some young, some older, some poor, some slightly better off. But they shared one truth: they were mothers. Women who had prepared for new life, only to meet death instead. Their families carried not only grief, but guilt. Guilt that they had not barred the door tightly enough, that they had not stayed awake through the night, that they had trusted a stranger who came promising help. For Inspector Vogel, these were not just names on a report. He visited their homes, spoke with their families, took portraits from grieving husbands to pin above his desk. He wanted to remember them as they had been, alive, smiling, hopeful, not only as the corpses he encountered beneath blood-stained sheets. His notes often drifted into sorrow. "We hunt a monster, but it is the mothers who are forgotten. The world speaks of her, but never of them." And in the streets of Berlin, their deaths changed everything. Mothers no longer trusted midwives. Fathers no longer left their wives alone when labor pains began. Children were told bedtime warnings. Don't open the door to strangers, or the Crimson Midwife will come. Yet even as their names faded from public memory, the scissors remained, a grotesque reminder of their final hours. The killer had stolen their children, but she had also stolen their identities, leaving behind only the crimson mark of her calling card. By the end of 1902, Berlin was no longer a city of progress and promise. It was a city of whispers, shutters drawn tight, and doorways bolted against the night. The Crimson Midwife had turned every tenement into a fortress of fear. Women refused to give birth at home without at least 2 relatives present, yet even that was not enough to soothe their dread. Fathers sat awake with pistols across their knees, listening for the faintest creak of floorboards or a knock on the door. Neighbors formed makeshift patrols, lanterns swinging as they marched the alleys, but their presence only deepened the paranoia. Anyone walking alone in a cloak was suddenly suspect. The newspapers had turned hysteria into profit. Bold sketches filled their pages, cloaked figures holding dripping scissors, babies swaddled in blood-stained cloths. Headlines shouted, "Demon midwife stalks Berlin," and mothers not safe in their own beds. Foreign correspondents arrived, eager to compare the murders to London's Jack the Ripper. Soon, Berlin was branded in the international press as a city haunted by its own phantom killer. The stories grew stranger with every retelling. Some swore the Crimson Midwife carried a lantern that never went out, guiding her through locked doors. Others claimed she could walk through walls, appearing beside mothers as they labored, leaving no sign of entry. A few even said she was not a woman at all, but a man in disguise. A doctor, a priest, a neighbor hiding in plain sight. Berliners began to see her everywhere. A midwife carrying a satchel, a woman with a bonnet walking quickly through the fog, a nurse leaving a hospital late at night. The fear was so deep that even the innocent became targets. Mobs formed and chased suspected women through the streets, sometimes beating them before the police could intervene. The church fanned the flames, declaring that the killings were not human crimes, but works of Satan. Priests warned mothers to baptize their infants immediately, lest the Crimson Midwife steal unbaptized souls for the devil. Families clutched rosaries as though the beads alone could bar her from entering their homes. Inspector Vogel watched the hysteria spiral out of control. Every false sighting pulled his officers in a new direction. Every rumor wasted precious hours. And with each new murder, the legend of the Crimson Midwife grew until it seemed she was no longer a single person, but an idea that stalked the entire city. Berlin was suffocating. The electric lamps that once lit its streets seemed dimmer. The hum of factories could not drown the silence that followed each knock at the door. And in the hearts of its people, one thought gnawed like a worm in the dark. If she could come for mothers in their own beds, where was anyone truly safe? If the missing infants were the deepest wound the Crimson Midwife left behind, the scissors were her signature, the chilling proof that she had been there, watching, waiting, choosing her moment. Always the same object, always placed with care. A pair of shears glistening with blood, set neatly on the nightstand or beside the cradle, as though it were less a weapon than a message. The families who discovered them often remembered the sight more than the body itself. One grieving husband said, "The scissors were alive with her. They looked at me as though she had left her eyes behind." Inspector Vogel studied every pair recovered from the scenes. At first glance, they were ordinary birthing shears, the kind used by midwives to cut umbilical cords or fabric swaddling. But closer inspection revealed something unsettling. They were all identical. Same length, same weight, same steel pattern etched faintly along the handles. It was as if they all came from one source. Where had she obtained them? The police scoured medical supply chains, blacksmith shops, and factories. They questioned merchants who sold tools to midwives, but none could account for the exact make. Some insisted the scissors looked foreign, imported. Others swore they were custom forged, designed for her alone. The symbolism could not be ignored. Scissors, an instrument meant to separate mother from child at the moment of birth, here became an emblem of death and loss. Each time the Crimson Midwife struck, she used them not just to end a life, but to sever the bond between parent and newborn forever. Forensic science was still primitive in 1902. But Vogel pressed his men to treat the scissors like evidence of the highest importance. They dusted them for fingerprints. None were ever found. They examined the blood, always belonging to the mother, never the child. Each pair was carefully bagged and stored, lined in a locked cabinet at police headquarters like a macabre collection of trophies. The press, hungry for sensation, exaggerated their meaning. Some papers called them Satan's blades. Others printed crude drawings showing symbols carved into the steel, claiming the scissors were cursed relics. Panic spread when rumors circulated that if you touched them, you would invite the midwife into your home. But Vogel saw something else in them, a compulsion. He wrote in his notes, "She leaves the scissors not because she must, but because she cannot stop herself. They are her mark, her boast, her handwriting. Each pair is a signature scrawled in blood." Theories abounded. Some detectives suggested she carried dozens of pairs with her, dropping one at each crime like a calling card. Others believed she cleaned them meticulously and reused the same pair, staging the placement with ritualistic precision. And among the public, the darker rumor spread that the scissors were never truly left behind. That each time, what the police recovered was only a phantom, a shadow left by a killer who carried the true blades still in her satchel, waiting for the next home, the next door left unguarded. Whatever the truth, one fact was undeniable. Whenever crimson scissors were found, a mother lay dead and an infant was gone. By the winter of 1903, Berlin had turned itself into a fortress. Families no longer opened their doors to strangers. Midwives were banned from practicing without official certification. Patrols swept the streets at night, lanterns blazing, pistols drawn. For months, no killings occurred. Some dared to believe the nightmare had ended. But the Crimson Midwife was not finished. On a frigid January morning, the staff at St. Hedwig's Hospital prepared for a busy day. The maternity ward was crowded, echoing with the cries of newborns. Doctors moved briskly between patients, nurses carried trays of instruments, and exhausted mothers clutched their infants close. Amid the bustle, no one noticed the woman in the dark cloak moving quietly through the corridors. She entered a small room where a mother named Greta Neumann had given birth just hours earlier. Greta was resting, pale but smiling faintly at the tiny bundle in her arms. The woman introduced herself with a calm voice, claiming she had come to check on the newborn. Greta, half asleep, offered no protest. When the nurse returned 20 minutes later, the room was silent. Greta lay motionless, her throat cut, her newborn gone. On the table beside the bed lay the familiar crimson scissors, gleaming in the pale light of morning. The hospital erupted in chaos. Guards were stationed at every exit, every ward searched from top to bottom. But the cloaked woman was nowhere. No footprints in the snow outside, no witness who remembered seeing her leave. It was as if she had vanished into the very walls. The killing at St. Hedwig's sent Berlin into hysteria. If even a hospital, the very heart of safety and science, could not keep her out, then nowhere was safe. Crowds gathered outside, screaming for answers. Priests declared the city cursed. The newspapers exploded with headlines, "Midwife of Death Invades Hospital," and Berlin's phantom strikes at the heart of the city. And then, silence. After the murder of Greta Neumann, the Crimson Midwife never struck again. No more scissors, no more missing infants, no more cloaked figure at the door. She had vanished, leaving Berlin trembling in her wake. Some believed she had been captured in secret, her identity hidden to prevent further scandal. Others insisted she had fled the city, perhaps moving on to prey upon another unsuspecting place. still more clung to the ghost stories, that she had never been human at all, but a spirit bound to take 12 souls, now satisfied and gone. Inspector Vogel, broken by the case, retired within a year. His notes, kept private until his death, ended with one chilling line: "She walked among us like smoke, and now she has returned to it." The silence after St. Hedwig's was almost worse than the killings themselves. For 2 years, Berlin had lived under the Crimson Midwife's shadow, counting each week between her strikes. And then, nothing. No bodies, no scissors, no missing infants. She had dissolved, leaving only terror in her wake. But while her crimes ceased, her legend only grew. Berliners could not stop speaking of her. Mothers whispered her name as a warning to their daughters. Fathers swore they still saw her shadow in alleyways, watching from beneath her bonnet. The city was no longer merely haunted by what she had done. It was possessed by the memory of her. Theories multiplied, each darker than the last. Some claimed she had been arrested in secret, the truth suppressed by embarrassed officials. Others swore she had fled to another city, her trail hidden in the chaos of Europe's growing urban sprawl. A few believed she had taken her own life, scissors in hand, vanishing into the same darkness she had inflicted on others. But for many, no earthly explanation was enough. To them, the Crimson Midwife was not a woman at all, but something older, a revenant spirit feeding on grief, bound to collect her quota of souls before fading back into the mist. Parents told children the story at bedtime. Sleep now, or the midwife will come, scissors dripping. The tale became folklore, passed from one generation to the next. Inspector Ernst Vogel lived out his remaining years in obscurity. His colleagues remembered him as a man hollowed by failure, forever carrying the weight of mothers he could not protect. When his journals were opened after his death, they revealed page after page of drawings, crude sketches of scissors over and over, until the lines blurred into chaos. His final note read, "Her hands were always there before mine." Today, historians argue whether the Crimson Midwife was real or a grim construction of rumor and panic. Some point to police files, stained with age, that list names and dates, hard proof of victims. Others insist she was a myth created by sensationalist newspapers. Her murders, the tragic accidents of childbirth, reframed as horror. Yet the legend remains. In Berlin's oldest districts, tour guides still speak of her. In nursing schools, her story lingers as a whispered warning of how trust can turn to terror. And in the minds of those who walk the narrow streets at night, a simple sound, the metallic snap of scissors, is enough to freeze the blood. The Crimson Midwife was never caught. Her true identity remains unknown, but her presence still hangs over Berlin like a shadow stitched into the city itself. And perhaps that is her cruelest legacy, that more than a century later, her name is remembered not as a woman's, but as a nightmare that still walks in the dark.